There are many different types of discrimination or difference tests, and one of the biggest subsets is paired comparison, or rather, are the paired comparison tests. So these are tests na merong dalawang sample and or say two treatments like A and B, and each treatment is presented once. So unlike the triangle or duo trio test that had uh, three samples presented to the panelists, so this one only has two. That's why it's called pair comparison. And since almost all discrimination tests are based on hypothesis testing based on probability, then our usual hypothesis for paired comparison test is that the probability of choosing A is equal to the probability of choosing B, which is equal to 1/2. Of course, the alternative hypothesis will depend on whether or not it is directional or not. So it could either be a not equal sign or a greater than or less than sign, depending on your objectives. So yung general procedure para sa paired comparison test, of course, meron kang dalawang samples. It's expected that they're supposed to have something that's different between them. Maybe it's a formulation difference, or one was stored at a different temperature, or maybe one was made at a different date. So basta dapat meron silang totoong pagkakaiba, kasi ang tatanong na natin is kung yung difference na yun ay kaya bang ma-detect or hindi ng panelist. So, okay, so you have, say, sample A and sample B. You assign them random 3-digit codes. And depending on the objectives of the test and the nature of the sample, you may present them simultaneously or one after the other. So, nasa sa inyo na rin yan, pero typically, hindi natin gusto na ipa-pre-taste, so to speak. No, kasi of course nandyan yung carry over ng flavors, etc. And ultimately baka mas ma-confuse sila kapag tikman ko si A, tikman ko si B, tikman ko si A, tikman ko si B, hindi ko pa rin alam kung anong difference nila. So manghuhula na lang ako. Okay, so obviously samples are presented in a random order, so that's either mauna si A or mauna si B. And depending on the type of paired comparison test, pwedeng itanong lang sa'yo, is this pair the same or are they different samples? Pwede rin papiliin ka, depende dun sa question. Basta pipiliin mong sagot is either one sample or the other. So the subcategories for this test include the directional paired comparison or two alternative forced choice method, the difference paired comparison test, also known as the simple difference test or the same different test. Yes, those are three names for the same thing, and this is being depicted here in this score sheet. And lastly, the degree of difference test. So let's look at them one by one. Directional paired comparison test. Paired kasi dalawa. Comparison kasi you have to make a choice between either sample. And directional because nakaspecify na yung attribute na i-evaluate mo. So, usually in this case, pwedeng mamili ka ng, let's say, sensory attribute like a basic taste, saltiness or sweetness, color like kung gaano katingkad yung pagkadilaw niya, texture, gaano siya ka-dry, and so on. Or maybe the strength of durian aroma, parang ganon, no? Okay. So once you've specified that attribute you want to measure, these instructions are usually just to choose typically kung alin dun sa dalawang sample yung mas mataas yung attribute. So, ano yung mas malakas yung durian aroma, alin yung mas maalat, then pili ka lang na isa. Okay, so in this example, of course, instead of using 3-digit codes, they used 3-letter codes. Syempre, meron pa ring proneness yan sa bias. You don't want to include actual words, no? You have to make sure na yung pagka-random niya ay talagang wala siyang ma-form na salita like boy or dog, parang ganon. But generally, we don't use this. other people do. Okay. So, where was I? Ayun, typically one-tailed ang directional paired comparison kasi may idea ka dapat kung alin dun sa dalawa yung mas, like for example, nag-reformulate ka, alam mong mas maraming sodium yung isa. So, pwede mong sabihin na may expected ka na dapat mas piliin nila yung isang sample kasi mas maraming sodium siya and therefore in reality siya dapat yung mas maalat. Pero hindi ka kasi sure kung enough ba yung the additional sodium na nilagay mo para maramdaman nila yung difference sa alat. On the other hand, I do believe that it's also possible to use a two-tailed test for directional paired comparison if you are comparing hypothetically to products, let's say, na hindi mo alam kung ano yung totoo. No? Halimbawa, pinagbangga mo yung fries ni Jollibee at McDo, tapos settle natin once and for all through science, sino nga ba mas maalat? So, you strip them of their packaging, blind code them, serve them at random to panelists, and so on. Alright, so in this case, the results indicate the direction of the specified difference between the two samples. So, kailangan talaga na sure ka na yun lang yung differential nila, no? Kasi, for example, kung ang tinetest mo pala ay alat, pero magkaiba din sila ng sugar content or magkaiba din sila ng color intensity sa surface, then you are introducing maybe biases into the mix that otherwise wouldn't have been there. Okay? So, kaya mas madalas ginagamit lang talaga to kapag ikaw yung may hawak sa pag-formulate ng mga products na iti-test mo. Alright? And that's why it's rarely used to compare, let's say, two brands in the market unless for somehow you've tested na mukhang ito lang naman talaga yung diferensya ng dalawang to. Okay. So because of yung dalawa lang yung samples mo and regardless of whether they're presented at the same time or monadically, meron ka lang dalawang combination ng order of presentation. Mauna si A or mauna si B. So here's an example of directional paired comparison test instruction. Okay, so ganyan lang siya, very simple lang, no? And you have to be specific kung magpapa-retaste ka or hindi. Lalo na madalas hindi, no? Kasi na-experience ko dati nung estudyante ko, walang sinabi yung nag-orient sa amin kung may pwedeng i-retaste or hindi. So nag-retaste ako ng sample and apparently nag-a-add yun ng variability dun sa test kasi merong mga panelists na nag-retaste, may panelists na hindi. Okay, so hindi na uniform yung procedure mo kung gano'n. So in this case, for example, tinanong lang sa'yo alin yung mas matamis from your perception and you simply encircle the code per set. Okay, so alin dito sa dalawang sa pares na ito yung mas matamis, dito naman sa second pair alin yung mas matamis. Napaka-simple. So usually even children could use this, no? Although you may want to use hindi yung 3-digit code kasi baka mamaya hindi pa nila kaya magbasa ng 3 digits lang. Alright, so next is the difference paired comparison test, simple difference test or same different test. So madali lang to, no? In this case, samples are usually presented at the same time unless there are constraints that would not allow you to do so. So meron kang dalawang sample and na nasa harapan mo. Tapos ang sasagutin mo lang is kung pareho ba sila o hindi. Now, of course, in this case, pwede ka talagang iserve ng dalawang sample na parehas, parehong A, parehong B, or pwede kang makakuha ng magkaiba like an AB pair or a BA pair. Okay? So the key here is to test whether or not you can detect a difference when there is none, or similarly, are you saying there's a difference when there is actually none? Now, halimbawa, parehong A yung binigay sa'yo, tapos sabi mo may difference sila. So, syempre, mali yun. Saka, Weird. Paano mo nasabing may difference? Exactly the same samples yan. Alright, so one-tailed itong test kasi ikaw bilang analyst, alam mo kung A or B yung binibigay mo. Diba? So, yon. Ito yung sample ng kanyang sensory score ballot. So, provided with samples, labeled with 3-digit codes, and you just evaluate them. Okay, palette cleansing instructions. Simply indicate if they're the same or different. So, take note in this case, walang parang direction na nasan ba yung difference? Nasa tamis ba? Nasa amoy? Nasa lasa? So, parang overall yung tinitignan mo. Or may makita ka lang na something different, na may giveaway siya. Yun na yung magiging basis mo for your answer. So, in this case, mag-check ka lang ng box. Pareho sila, magkaiba sila. Ganon. And sometimes they leave a box for comments. Maybe the person would answer, obvious kasi magkaiba ng kulay, sunod yung isa, ganon. No? So, pwede yun. Again, this is a probability-based hypothesis. So, therefore, you want an alternative hypothesis wherein the person could get the correct answer more than half of the time. So, pag ganito na meron kang apat nga na combination for serving AA, BB, AB, or BA. And ito lang yung isa pang example ng paano pwedeng i-format yung test ballot or questionnaire mo. So, similar to the first test, we also have the paired comparison test for degree and or direction of difference. Dito naman, hindi kailangan mo rin i-specify yung attribute na i-analyze. So, for example, in this case, the flavor difference. And then, usually, gusto mong malaman gaano kalaki yung agwat nila. So, sabi nga natin, ordinal ito. In this case, you have 4 choices. And then, you also want to know the direction. So, the degree of difference is gaano kalaki yung agwat. The direction would be alin yung mas intense yung flavor. Okay? So, in which case, again, you must be sure that there are no other differences in the sample or you at least try to control. No? Kasi alam ko minsan din, halimbawa, you're controlling for sweetness. So, sugar lang yung difference ng dalawang formulation. Pero increasing the sugar content might affect the texture of, let's say, the cookie that you want to test. No? So, pero syempre, at least tinry mong i-limit yung possible na differences nila by, let's say, not adding salt when sugar is the thing you're testing for. Okay. As a variation to the simple difference test, we now have the A not A test. So simply put, forced siya na monadic. So one at a time yung pag-serve ng sample. And because of this, it forces you to rely on memory. Okay? And bakit siya ginagamit pa? Kasi may mga times na kapag pinagtabi mo yung sample, napakahalata ng difference. Pero kapag halimbawa inalis mo, hindi na. So, for example, in real life situations, di ba, hindi ka naman talaga iinom ng, let's say, Coke at Pepsi at the same time, right? So, you would only rely on the differences from your memory na, lasang Pepsi to, lasang Coke to. Okay? Pero mamaya, may mga bagay na pag pinagtabi mo, ay napaka-obvious ng difference. Let's say, it's a 2 brands of peanut butter, they have similar consistencies, but the levels of brownness, one is dark brown and the other is a bit lighter. So, pero hindi naman nila ma-memorize yung pagkaitim ng kulay, di ba? Lalo na kapag inalis na yung first sample. Okay. So anyway, because it's similar to the same different test, usually, yun nga, walang kinikilingan ito na hindi mo sasabihin sabihin mo alin yung mas maalat or mas malakas yung peanut aroma. Walang ganon, Mars, no? Okay, so here's a sample ballot for it, provided with samples that are labeled with A. So in this case, hindi siya, well, it's labeled with a 3-digit code. Pero you presume that the first sample is A. Okay? So the first sample is A and the other sample is automatically labeled with a 3-digit code. Okay. Um, then based on that, you taste the sample and determine or decide whether you think it's A or not A. And dito, meron pang pagpipilian na whether sure ka ba o hindi, no? So parang this adds a layer of statistical complexity based on how you will treat the answers. Pero pwede rin naman na wala yung I am not sure. Parang it's A lang or it's not A, no? So, and then dito parang required yung comments para sabihin mo bakit siya not A, okay? So, may konting freedom naman tayo to modify things, no, in our test ballot, but bear in mind that these have statistical consequences if done so. So again, the A not A test is just a same difference test presented in a sequential manner. Therefore, it also has the same serving combinations. And again, it's only limited in use when very obvious appearance variables are there but cannot be removed. However, those differences should not be so obvious that even removing the sample would make you remember na magkaiba sila. Kasi kung sobrang obvious nung pagkakaiba, hindi mo na kailangan ipa-sensory. Parang kumbaga common sense na yan kung pink yung isa, black yung isa, or yung difference in their lightness is so obvious that you'd remember it 10 days after pa. Or wag mo na i-test, sayang sa pera. With sensory tests, usually maraming nagagawang mga variation over the years, no? Like a certain analyst would try to improve upon or tailor fit a certain test to his or her needs. Okay, so we also have the standard A not A test, which is yan, meron siyang kasamang training phase instead of receiving just one pair of samples. Okay. Meron kang una muna, bibigyan ka, ito yung A, at ito yung not A. Okay. Tapos ay bibigyan ka ng magkakaibang pairs for the training after the training phase. One would be monadic A or not A. So the next would be paired. So served at the same time. Next would be replicates. And then a mixed replicate. So probably this will be used to familiarize yourself now with let's say you have a product and ito yung standard mo for a product, tapos gusto mong mag-train ng panelist mo para malaman niya ito pasok to sa standard ng product, ito hindi. And usually that standard is a combination of different things like ganitong mouthfeel, ganitong aroma, and so on, such that when you present the A or the standard sample, any deviation from that, alam nilang, ay, ito yung not A. I don't think you'll be doing this in the lab, no, but just so you know, meron ganito. So as mentioned earlier, we have what we call the duo-trio test. This is no longer paired comparison because obviously there are two samples, even though the identity of those samples ay dalawa lang, either A siya or B siya. So in a duo-trio test, you have a sample labeled R as the reference, and this is usually the first one to be evaluated and the first one to be presented. And then you are followed by two samples randomly coded, one of which would be A and one of which would be B. Obviously, one of them is like the reference. So kapag duo-trio, medyo binabolster mo dito yung kakayanan ng tao na match to the reference. So sometimes the reference would always be the product that is in question. Yun yung tinatawag nating constant reference duo-trio, wherein, for example, the reference is always A. Okay, but of course the panelists would not know that. No? So because of that, the probability of getting the correct answer, even though there are three samples, is 1/2 because you only choose either this or this. So kaya pala siya tinawag na duo trio kasi yung coded samples is your duo and three samples together would be your trio. So again, one advantage of this test is yung possibility na matikman mo yung, ma-reinforce yung um, ability to detect the difference kasi you can compare it to the reference. So technically in this case, no, ang kino-compare mo is not A versus B, but A versus the reference and B versus the reference, no. So kaya take note din dito sa setup na ito, mas marami yung amount ng reference kesa dun sa dalawang sample. Kasi nga, i-compare mo yung reference twice. Okay? Or in this case, obviously, may retasting na nagaganap. Which is possible naman kasi nga, you are comparing to the reference. Although you should instruct no, siguro kung papayagan mo na i-retaste yung isang sample after matikman na yung pangalawa. Because that may introduce errors. So in most difference tests, especially such as this one, you want the samples to be as homogeneous as possible. And the difference should be something na hindi obvious, no? Again, we don't know what the direction of the difference will, we don't know where the difference lies exactly. Hindi mo alam kung sa aroma yan, sa appearance, or overall lang yung combination ng subtle combination ng subtle differences na yun would cause you to say, basta iba tong isa. Hindi mo naman kailangan magpaliwanag basta sabihin mo lang kung magkaiba siya o hindi, no? Okay, or rather, ito yung kamatch ni or ito yung hindi. Okay. Again, probability of getting a chance by guess is 50%. So para lang kasi yung true or false, di ba? Okay, and it's a one-tailed test because as the experimenter, alam mo kung alin yung A, alam mo kung alin yung B. Okay. And usually, kung formulation yan, may hawak ka kung sino talaga, ano yung difference sa formulation na may expected result. Okay, so you present three samples, one reference and two unknown. The reference again is always labeled R, while the unknowns are with 3-digit codes. One of the coded samples will always be identical to R. And you have the option to present R first and then remove it, or ask them to evaluate R first, but then still have the other two samples there simultaneously. Okay, and A and B are presented in random order, but of course R is always first. And panelists are asked to identify which sample is like the reference. So here's just another example of a duo trio test from Lawless and Heyman. This one is a balanced reference duo trio test. So there are three samples and then replicated siya. So may two sets yan of three samples. In each set, one of the coded is the same one as the reference. So you taste the reference first and then taste the samples from left to right. In this case, it did specify no retasting. Okay. And then of course you are to encircle the sample code, which is most similar to the reference. And there's a specific instruction to not swallow any of the samples or the water. So everything is expectorated. No? One of the reasons for this is para hindi ka maumay or ma-fatigue kasi 6 samples in succession yung titikman mo. No? And ayaw mo ng carryover effects for those. Medyo kadiri lang isipin, pero we do this depending on the sample, especially when we're not dealing with consumers. So again, as we mentioned, merong dalawang klase ng duo trio test, constant reference and balanced reference. Constant reference means that you're using only one of the two samples as a reference throughout the test, whereas in a balanced reference duo trio, the panelists can receive either A as a reference or B as a reference. And then for each reference type, there are two possible combinations, A, B, and BA. So, kung constant reference ka, two combinations lang. Kung balance reference, a total of 4. Okay, so typically we use the constant reference if there is a certain familiarity with the reference product and we want that familiarity bolstered. No? Like for example, you're a company and yung reference is yung current product ninyo or the standard product. Then you could use a constant reference and proven naman na mas malaki yung chance na ma-match mo siya sa reference na familiar ka kaysa kung gawin mong balanced reference or gawin mong reference yung B product mo na let's say bago siya or first time mo lang matitikman. So triangle test or mas commonly known as alinang naiba. In this test, you are given 3 samples and then you are to find out or identify which is the odd one out. So therefore, in these 3 samples, either 2 of them are A or 2 of them are B. And similar to a multiple choice test, you have a 1/3 chance of getting the correct answer. So it's similar to do a trio test and simple difference test. It only shows the presence or absence of a difference. You cannot quantify the direction or assume that it is a difference in a specific attribute like taste, color, and the like. This is usually a one-tailed test because again, you already know dun sa tatlong sinerve mo sa panelist alin yung naiba. Okay? So the N alternative forced choice test wherein you have more than 2 samples, similar lang sa dun sa 2 alternative but you have N alternatives, in this case na 3, and you ask which among the samples has the greatest amount of a certain attribute. Then there are also the many variants of the sorting method wherein you are given, well, you could have at least 4 samples siguro to call it sorting, no? But basically you have samples are either A or B, and then kung ilan man sila, you just sort them out into which are A and which are B. So the probabilities are dependent on how many samples there are. But for example, for the 2 out of 5, there are 10 possible combinations na nakahati siya na dalawa sa isang side, tatlo sa kabila. So these large sorting tests are rarely used because of the possibility of sensory fatigue. But it's useful when your samples are have differences on tactile and appearance properties. So yung parang tititigan mo lang, hawakan mo lang, pipisil-pisilin mo lang, hindi mo na kailangan tikman para malaman yung pagkakaiba nila. Alright? Of course, these things can also be used for training, lalo na yung mga may high chance na hindi mo mahulaan, and because you want to also develop na matagalan bago magkaroon ng sensory fatigue yung trained panelist mo. So, generally, these difference or discrimination tests can also be used in applications involving quality control because you want to determine if it's different from the standard product regardless kung ma-determine mo kung saang attribute siya nagkakaiba. But generally, in those cases, even a triangle test would do kasi ito maaksaya na rin sa sample